On April 3rd, 2016, somewhere between 9 and 10 o'clock on a Sunday evening, millions of people sat in front of their televisions and watched the most anticipated finale in the history of The Walking Dead play out across their screens. The show had spent the better part of its 6th season constructing a single promise: that the audience was about to meet someone who would change everything. Not just the storyline, not just the direction of the season, everything. The show had been running for 6 years. It had given its audience the Governor. It had given them Gareth and the cannibals of Terminus. It had given them the wolves. And it had given them half a dozen crises that should have, by any reasonable measure, constituted the worst that the post-apocalyptic Eastern Seaboard had to offer. None of them had prepared anyone for what was coming. The 6th season finale of The Walking Dead, an episode called Last Day on Earth, was not a great episode by the standards the show had set for itself in its best years. It was 90 minutes of deliberate, almost methodical tension building, roadblock after roadblock, forcing Rick Grimes and his group off their planned route, each obstruction larger and more impossible than the last, each one a message delivered without words. You cannot go where you want to go. You cannot do what you want to do. Someone else is in charge now, and you don't know who that someone else is yet, and the not knowing is the point. The show withheld its answer for nearly the entire running time, and when the answer finally arrived, stepping out of an RV on a dark road in Virginia, wearing a leather jacket and carrying a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire, the show's audience collectively understood something that television viewers rarely get to understand in real time. They understood that they were watching something new. The man who stepped out of that RV introduced himself as Negan. He had not spoken a single word before that moment. He had existed only as a name, whispered by frightened survivors, invoked by armed men on motorcycles, as both an identity and a threat, treated by every community the show had visited in the latter half of the season as a force of nature rather than a person. And now he was standing in a clearing surrounded by hundreds of his followers, all of them carrying torches, all of them arranged in a formation so precisely staged it looked less like a roadside ambush and more like a ceremony. He smiled. He introduced the baseball bat. He looked at the 11 people on their knees in front of him the way a person looks at a problem they have already solved a long time ago in their mind. And then he began to speak. What followed in the minutes after that introduction, and in the seasons that followed, and in the extraordinary backstory episode that the show would not deliver for another 5 years, constitutes the most complete construction of a villain that The Walking Dead ever attempted. Not the most terrifying villain, not the most powerful villain, the most complete one. The one whose greatness as a dramatic creation exists not in spite of his humanity, but precisely because of it. Because the show, at its very best, understood that the most frightening thing about Negan was not what he was capable of doing with Lucille. The most frightening thing about Negan was how easy it was, once you understood his history, to trace the exact path from the man he had been to the man he became. The most frightening thing about Negan was the comprehensibility of his destruction. This video is going to argue that Negan is the greatest villain in the history of The Walking Dead. Not because he killed the most people, not because he was the most physically imposing threat the show ever produced. Not because Jeffrey Dean Morgan's performance elevated the character beyond what was written for him, although it did, consistently and unmistakably, across every season in which he appeared. The argument is simpler and more unsettling than any of those things. Negan is the greatest villain in the history of The Walking Dead because the show built him correctly. It built him as a mirror, a reflection of the world Rick Grimes and his group had been constructing since the first episode aired on October 31st, 2010. Every brutal thing Negan did, every system of dominance he created, every act of violence he committed or authorized, forced the audience to ask the same question that the best villain in any story always forces an audience to ask. What exactly is the difference between him and the people we are rooting for? The show kept arriving at the same answer, and the answer was more uncomfortable than any baseball bat. This video will move through Negan's story in 3 phases. The first is the construction, who Negan was before the world ended, and what it cost him to become the man who stepped out of that RV. The second is the reign, what Negan's system of control actually was, how it worked, what it did to the people it touched, and what it revealed about the world the apocalypse had created. And the third is the reckoning, the long, slow, earned process of a man living inside the consequences of what he became, deciding whether the person he was before still exists inside the person he is now, and whether that even matters anymore. But before we begin, if you could just take a moment to subscribe, it is completely free, and it genuinely helps this channel more than you know. Anyway, that is enough of that. Let us get into it. Here is what almost no one who watched Negan step out of that RV on April 3rd, 2016 would have guessed about him. Before the world ended, he was a gym teacher, not a soldier, not a criminal, not a warlord in waiting with a history of organised violence who simply found the apocalypse a more hospitable environment for what he had always been. He was a high school gym teacher in Reston, Virginia, who had received formal complaints about his use of vulgar language in front of students, who had eventually lost that job after assaulting a parent, and who had spent the months before the outbreak playing video games online and trading insults with teenagers he would never meet in person. He was not a remarkable man. He was not a dangerous man. He was a man whose life had contracted to a very small perimeter, and who had not yet figured out what to do about that. He was married to a woman named Lucille. That is where everything starts and everything ends, and everything in between draws its meaning from. The marriage was not a simple thing. Negan was having an affair, a fact he kept concealed from everyone involved for as long as he could manage, which is to say he was doing what people do when they are caught between what they have and what they want and cannot bring themselves to choose. His wife did not know. His mistress did not know that he was married. The lie was structured the way most functional long-term lies are structured, which is to say, it required a great deal of maintenance and generated a great deal of private guilt that Negan managed by not examining it too carefully. He was not a good husband. He knew he was not a good husband. He had filed that knowledge somewhere he did not need to look at it every day, and he kept moving. Then Lucille collapsed. It happened during an argument, which is to say it happened during the ordinary weather of their marriage, and the argument stopped and Negan took her to the hospital. She was diagnosed with cancer. In the hospital room, while the weight of that diagnosis was still settling over everything, Negan called his mistress and told her the truth. She left immediately. He stayed. Whatever Negan was in those years before the world ended, unfaithful, avoidant, smaller in his private life than he would ever have admitted to anyone. In that hospital room, faced with the most irreversible piece of information he had ever received, he made a choice. He stayed with his wife. That choice is worth sitting with, because everything that follows, every act of violence, every kingdom built on fear and tribute, every person who knelt before Lucille and called themselves Negan, all of it flows from that moment in a hospital room where a man who had not been particularly good chose for the first time to be present, to be accountable, to not leave, and the world did not reward him for it. The world ended instead. The Walking Dead has always been a show about what people become when the structures that define them disappear. Take away the laws, take away the institutions, take away the social contracts that tell people who they are and how they are supposed to behave, and what remains is something much more elemental and much more revealing. The show asked that question of Rick Grimes from its very first episode. It asked it of Shane Walsh and of Carol Pelletier and of Michonne and of every other character who survived long enough to be genuinely transformed by the world the outbreak created. What it never did, for the first several years of Negan's presence in the story, was ask it of Negan himself. It presented Negan as the answer to the question rather than as someone the question had been asked of. He was the thing people became. He was not, in those early seasons, a person who had become that thing. There is a fundamental difference between those two framings, and the show did not fully reckon with it until the season 10 episode, called Here's Negan, aired on April 4th, 2021, 5 years after Jeffrey Dean Morgan first appeared on screen. Here's Negan was the 22nd episode of the 10th season. It was directed by Laura Belsey and written by David Leslie Johnson McGoldrick, and it drew from a standalone comic story that Robert Kirkman had originally serialized in the Image Comics magazine Image Plus beginning in 2016, before it was collected and published as its own volume in 2017. The episode received strong reviews from critics. Jeffrey Dean Morgan, who had been playing Negan since 2016 and who had been requesting this episode for the entirety of that run, called it probably the coolest thing he had ever gotten to do. He said he and the producers had been discussing it for 5 years. The episode, when it finally arrived, delivered on everything that 5 years of anticipation had built. What the episode revealed, and what the earlier seasons had only suggested in fragments, is that Negan's life before the outbreak was not a life without love. It was a life without honesty. Those are not the same thing, and the distinction matters enormously to understanding who he became. Lucille Smith was his wife. She is played in the backstory episode by Hilary Burton Morgan, who is Jeffrey Dean Morgan's real-life wife. A casting choice that added a layer of genuine intimacy to their scenes together that no amount of professional craft could have fully manufactured. She is depicted in the flashbacks as warm, sharp, and entirely clear-eyed about Negan's deficiencies as a partner. Not naive about who she had married, but committed to the marriage in a way that her husband had not yet learned to match. Their life together, in those pre-outbreak flashbacks, is rendered with the texture of a real relationship. Disagreements over money, private jokes, the specific kind of tired companionship that long marriages develop when the initial intensity has settled into something quieter and more durable. They watch movies together. They eat whatever they can find in the kitchen and call it dinner. She asks him to return the $600 leather jacket he bought because they cannot afford it. He throws away the receipt instead, and she discovers the jacket months later, hidden in the floorboards of their house, which tells you everything you need to know about the specific way Negan expressed his stubbornness. That jacket, by the way, is the same jacket he wears for every subsequent appearance in the television series. It survived the end of the world because Lucille hid it, and because Negan found it, and because in the absence of everything else, the jacket became a piece of continuity he could carry. Think about that for a moment. The leather jacket that became the most recognizable element of the most feared man in the post-apocalyptic Eastern Seaboard started as a domestic dispute between a married couple about household finances. That is either deeply humanizing or deeply absurd, and the show understood that it was both simultaneously. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. When Lucille was diagnosed with cancer, as the show would confirm across multiple episodes, when Negan discusses his wife in terms that do not permit any ambiguity about what the disease cost both of them, Negan's entire existence reorganized itself around her care. He ended the affair. He came home. He learned, because there was no one else to do it, how to administer chemotherapy treatments, himself, in a house, without medical supervision. Because by the time the outbreak began, the hospital was no longer a reliable option, and the doctors were either dead or evacuated or simply gone. He sat with her through the treatments. He cleaned up after the treatments. He told her she was beautiful when the treatment had taken everything from her that it could take, and the evidence available suggests he meant it every time he said it. This is the version of Negan that the show withheld for 5 years, not because the information was unavailable. Kirkman had published it in comic form, and the broad outlines of Negan's history were accessible to anyone who sought them out, but because the show understood something sophisticated about dramatic sequencing. You cannot make an audience grieve for a man's losses before you have made them fear him. If the backstory had arrived before the Season 7 premiere, before Lucille the Bat had done what it did in that clearing on a dark road in Virginia, the audience would have received the grief without the context that makes it devastating. It is only after you have watched Negan use the bat that the origin of the bat means anything at all. The violence has to come first, then the source of the violence, then the distance between the two, and what filled it. What filled it was the worst 7 months of his life. What filled it was the apocalypse arriving while his wife was already dying, compounding the unsurvivable with the literally unsurvivable, and leaving him to navigate both at the same time with no infrastructure, no support, and no one who could tell him what to do next. When the outbreak began, Negan refused to leave the hospital. Lucille was on life support. The hospital staff informed him they were being forced to evacuate, and he refused to go. He stayed in a building that was emptying of every person who might have been able to help him, in a world that was filling with the dead, and he stayed because he had already made the choice once and he was not going to unmake it. This is the detail about Negan that no conversation about his villainy can afford to skip over and still claim to be honest. His first act in the apocalypse was not a violent one. It was the act of staying in a room with someone he loved when every rational calculation available to him said to leave. When Lucille finally came home, when the hospital became untenable and the two of them were together in their house, running out of the chemotherapy supplies the hospital had provided, Negan began the process of trying to replace them. He needed the specific drugs that were keeping her alive. He went looking for them in a world that had very recently stopped functioning as a place where specific drugs could be reliably obtained. In the Here's Negan episode, this search is depicted through a series of encounters that show the earliest version of the man he would eventually become. Not the polished, leather-jacketed authority of the sanctuary, but something rawer and more desperate. He is frightened in these scenes. He is making it up as he goes. He carries the baseball bat because he needs something to carry, and because a bat requires no ammunition, and because the world he is moving through has already taught him that the people still alive in it are not uniformly safe to be around. He finds a medical supply camp. He encounters a woman named Laura, who would eventually become one of his first saviors, though neither of them knows that yet, and her father. They receive him without hostility. They give him the chemotherapy drugs he needs. They give him additional supplies. They talk with him the way people who have not yet calcified into the survival calculus of the new world still talk to strangers, with something resembling trust. Laura's father gives him the baseball bat, the one he's been carrying, as an additional protective measure against a local gang that has been threatening the camp. Negan takes it. It is a gift from strangers who are trying to help him keep his wife alive. He brings the medicine home. There is a brief window, depicted in the episode with the specific warmth of a moment both characters know cannot last, where he and Lucille sit together in their house, eating whatever they have, watching DVDs, being a married couple in the ruins of civilization in the way that people do when they have run out of other options and chosen each other anyway. She is wearing a purple wig because the treatment has taken her hair. He does not mention the wig. He talks to her the same way he has always talked to her. She laughs at him. He laughs back. The last chemo treatment failed. The drugs he had obtained were not sufficient. There was nothing else he could do, and he had come to understand that. He left to find more, because leaving to find more was the only action available to him that felt like not surrendering. When he came back, Lucille was gone. She had taken her own life. The evidence suggests she had decided that releasing Negan from the responsibility of her care was an act of love, that she was sparing him from watching the remaining stages of a deterioration that the end of the world had already made impossible to manage with any dignity. She was wrong in the specific way that people who make enormous decisions on behalf of other people without consulting them are wrong. She was trying to protect him. She could not know that what she was actually doing was detonating the charge that would eventually produce the sanctuary and Lucille the Bat and every community broken under the weight of the tribute system she never lived to see. Negan could not bring himself to do what the apocalypse required of him in that moment. He could not stop her from turning. He burned the house down instead. He walked out into the world with the baseball bat, and with the leather jacket Lucille had told him to return, and with a grief so total and so structurally complete that it had hollowed out the part of him that used to ask whether things were right or wrong. He still had rules. He would always have rules, because rules were the scaffolding that made the grief manageable, the thing that created the illusion of order in a person whose internal order had collapsed entirely. But the rules were his rules now. They answered to nothing outside himself. There was nothing outside himself left to answer to. He named the bat after his wife, not as a trophy, not as a sick joke, as the last piece of her that he had, in a world where every other piece was ash. That is the origin. Not a monster discovering his nature, a man discovering that the structures which had kept his worst impulses in check, the social contract, the law, the quiet accountability of being known by other people, were gone, and that what remained in their absence was not nothing. What remained was a will so powerful and a grief so total that when they combined, they produced something the post-apocalyptic world had not yet seen. Someone who was genuinely, comprehensively unafraid. The saviours in the period before Negan's story intersects with Rick Grimes's were described in the Season 8 episode, The Big Scary You, as having been, before Negan's arrival, a loose confederation of assholes. That is Negan's own characterization, delivered to Father Gabriel Stokes, while the two of them are trapped together inside the Walker-filled sanctuary in a scene that constitutes the first real window the show had given the audience into the thinking behind the man. Negan had found a group of people who were surviving through violence, with no particular system beyond the violence, and he had done to them what he had done to everything else. In the years since the outbreak, he had organised it. He had applied rules. He had built a structure around the chaos that was already there, and told the people inside it that the structure was what kept them alive, which was, by the time Rick Grimes encountered him, functionally true. The sanctuary was a terrible place in many specific ways. It was not, however, an incompetent one. Understanding what Negan built requires understanding what the world looked like before he arrived in Rick Grimes' story, because the two things are inseparable. The Walking Dead had spent 5.5 seasons establishing Rick and his group as the most capable, most ruthless, and most morally compromised survivor collective in the post-apocalyptic landscape they were navigating. They had walked out of the prison. They had survived the governor twice. They had walked through Terminus and dismantled the wolves and built Alexandria from a functioning suburb into something resembling a functional society. By the middle of Season 6, Rick's group had reached a point of operational confidence that bordered on something the show had rarely allowed itself to depict. They were winning. Not comfortable, not safe, not free from loss, but winning, in the specific sense of consistently defeating whatever the world sent at them and remaining intact on the other side. The show had been building toward a correction of that confidence for the entirety of the back half of Season 6, and the mechanism it chose for that correction was Negan's name appearing in the world before Negan's face did. The first time the Saviours announced themselves by name in the story, it is Season 6, Episode 9, an episode called No Way Out. Daryl, Abraham and Sasha are travelling back toward Alexandria when a group of armed men on motorcycles blocks their road. The confrontation is brief and lopsided. The Saviours take their weapons. Their leader delivers the message that will echo forward through the rest of the season. Your property now belongs to Negan, that is all. No elaboration, no explanation of who Negan is or what Negan wants beyond what that sentence already contains. The name lands in the story the way a fact lands, not as something being argued, but as something simply being stated. Your property now belongs to Negan. This is the new condition of the world. Adjust accordingly. The effect of that introduction is deliberate and precisely calibrated. The show had used this technique before with the governor, building a reputation before showing the face, but never with this degree of systematic patience. In the second half of Season 6, the audience encounters the Saviours repeatedly before they encounter Negan. They encounter communities that have been living under the tribute system for long enough that the system has become simply the way things are. The Hilltop Colony, when Jesus brings Rick's group there in the episode Knots Untie, is a settlement of people who have organised their entire existence around the assumption that the Saviours cannot be defeated, only accommodated. The leader of the Hilltop, Gregory, is a man whose primary defining characteristic is his absolute conviction that resistance is not an available option. He has seen what happens to people who resist. He has adjusted accordingly. When Rick's group arrives at the hilltop and hears for the first time a full accounting of what the Saviours are and how the tribute system works, the audience receives this information through Rick's ears. And Rick's initial response, the offer to take care of the Saviours in exchange for half the hilltop's supplies, is so confident, so characteristic of the Rick Grimes the show had been building across 5.5 seasons that it reads almost as comedy. He has just been told about an organisation with enough manpower to subjugate multiple communities across a large geographic area. His response is essentially, "We can handle this. Give us half your food." What the show is doing in this moment, with precision that is only apparent in retrospect, is letting Rick's confidence function as dramatic irony. The audience does not yet know everything Negan is, but the show knows. And it is letting Rick walk, with complete assurance, toward a correction that will be total and irreversible. The season-long roadblock sequence in the finale called Last Day on Earth is the formal delivery of that correction. And it is worth describing in detail because the craft of it is extraordinary. Rick's group is attempting to transport Maggie Green to the Hilltop Medical Facility because Maggie is experiencing complications with her pregnancy and needs care that Alexandria cannot provide. It is a straightforward errand with a clear humanitarian purpose, which makes what happens to the errand feel all the more precisely cruel. The first roadblock is a group of Saviours blocking a road. Rick's group turns around and finds another route. The second roadblock is larger, more Saviours on a different road, making the same silent declaration. You cannot go where you want to go. Rick turns around again. The third blockade is larger still, and this one includes a man being hanged from an overpass, a message delivered at a scale that demands to be taken seriously. The group changes course again. The fourth blockade is something the show had not previously attempted in 6 seasons of increasingly baroque peril. A full highway closure, managed by hundreds of armed people, with flaming logs and a chained cluster of walkers, and the clear operational sophistication of an organisation that does not improvise these things. It has done this before, many times. It knows exactly what it is doing. What the sequence accomplishes across the 90 minutes of the finale is the systematic dismantling of the audience's confidence in Rick's group alongside Rick's own. Each roadblock that proves impassable is a data point. Each redirect that leads to another wall is additional evidence. By the time the group is surrounded in the woods and Saviours with flashlights emerge from every direction, herding them toward a clearing where they are instructed to get on their knees, the audience has already done the math. The math does not favour Rick Grimes. The kneeling sequence before Negan ever appears is itself a masterwork of sustained dread. Dwight brings out Daryl, Glenn, Michonne and Rosita, who had been captured earlier. They are placed in the line with Rick's group. 11 people on their knees in a clearing surrounded by torchlight and armed men in the middle of a night that the show renders in a very particular kind of darkness. Not pitch black, but dim enough that faces are uncertain. That scale is difficult to judge, that the number of people standing around the kneeling group feels genuinely unknowable. This is not accidental cinematography. This is the construction of a specific psychological state in both the characters and the audience. You are not sure how many of them there are. You are not sure what is about to happen. You are sure that whatever it is, you cannot stop it. Then the door of the RV opens. Jeffrey Dean Morgan had been cast as Negan in 2015, nearly a year before this scene aired, and his casting had been one of the most discussed pieces of Walking Dead news in years. He was not the only actor the show had considered. Matthew Lillard had been one of the final candidates before Morgan received the role. Henry Rollins, whose appearance had directly inspired the look of Negan in the original comic, as confirmed by artist Charlie Adlard, had auditioned. John Hamm was reportedly Robert Kirkman's personal pick for the role, though he never formally auditioned. Matt Dillon was also reportedly considered. Morgan got the part, and from the moment he steps out of that RV, it is impossible to imagine anyone else in it. He is smiling. That is the first thing. He has stepped into a clearing surrounded by hundreds of his own people and 11 survivors on their knees, and he is smiling in the way that people smile when something has gone exactly as they planned. Not a triumphant smile, not a cruel smile, a smile of genuine, relaxed satisfaction. He is comfortable here. This is not a situation he finds stressful. It is a situation he has created, and he finds it well made. He introduces himself. He says his name once, clearly, without emphasis or theatre, the way you say your name when you expect people to already know it. He walks the line of kneeling survivors with the easy gait of a person on a tour of their own property, which is precisely what he is doing. He is inspecting what will, from this moment forward, belong to him. He asks who is in charge. When Rick identifies himself, Negan appraises him with the specific attention of a person assessing an asset's value. He is not afraid of Rick. He has never been afraid of Rick. He has never been afraid of Rick. He has been waiting for this meeting. He introduces Lucille. He says the bat is awesome. He says this with exactly the same tone he uses for everything else. Direct, unhurried, with just enough warmth to be disorienting. He explains his proposed structure for how things are going to work from this point forward, and the explanation is almost reasonable. Almost. The logic of it is clear enough that you could, if you were trying, argue that it is not the worst possible arrangement for survivors who need protection and cannot provide it for themselves. You work for Negan. You give him half of what you have. In exchange, Negan's people do not kill you. The system has internal consistency. It scales. It is, in the very specific language of post-apocalyptic political science, a protection racket, which is to say, it is the oldest form of organised power that exists. But there is a condition. Because Rick's group killed Saviours, a series of events that had unfolded across the second half of the season, in which Rick and his people had attacked Saviour outposts with lethal efficiency, including a nighttime raid on what they believed was Negan's compound that killed dozens of people in their sleep. Because of that, there must be a demonstration. Not revenge, not punishment for its own sake. A demonstration. Someone has to die tonight, in front of everyone, so that the terms of the new arrangement are understood at a level below language. Negan explains this the way you explain a policy. This is how it works. This is what resistance costs. Now that you know, you can make better choices. He holds up Lucille, and he begins the game. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. The children's rhyme, repurposed as a selection mechanism for an execution, is Negan's final act of psychological control in that clearing. It is more sophisticated than it appears. A direct selection would assign blame to Negan. He chose this person. He killed this person. The grief and rage of the survivors would have a clear and specific target. The rhyme removes that clarity. It introduces an element of random chance into a situation that was always going to end the same way, which is to say it was never random at all. Someone was always going to die in that clearing, and Negan always knew that. But it diffuses the audience's ability to locate its anger. It distributes the horror across all 11 people simultaneously, because any of them could be the one the rhyme lands on, and the waiting is the point. You cannot hate Negan for the choice because the choice appears not to be a choice. You can only sit in the waiting. He walks the line, the bat moves from face to face. Each person kneeling in front of him has been established across multiple seasons as a character the audience has invested in. The show knows this. That is precisely why it is doing what it is doing. He is not just threatening a nameless group of survivors. He is threatening Glenn, who survived Atlanta with Rick in the first episode of the series. He is threatening Abraham, who carried Eugene across half the country in the belief that Eugene had a cure. He is threatening Michonne, who rebuilt herself from the ruins of a person into something extraordinary. He is threatening Rosita and Sasha and Maggie, who is pregnant, and Carl, who is Rick's son, and Rick himself, whose entire arc across 6 seasons has been the story of a man willing to do whatever the world required of him to keep his people alive. The rhyme ends, the bat lands, the screen cuts to black. The season 6 finale of The Walking Dead ends on that cut to black, and it is one of the most divisive creative decisions the show ever made. The audience had just watched 90 minutes of constructed dread culminate in a moment that did not reveal its own resolution. They would have to wait until the following season, until October of 2016, to find out who had died. The cliffhanger was criticised extensively. It was called manipulative. It was called disrespectful to the audience. By any reasonable measure, those criticisms were not entirely wrong. The show had used its audience's emotional investment as a lever to extend a commercial break by several months. And the audience, many of whom had already speculated extensively about who the victim was, felt that the withholding was a betrayal of something. Here is the thing about that cliffhanger that makes it different from a simple ratings stunt. The waiting was not accidental. It was the experience. The 6 months between the season 6 finale and the season 7 premiere were 6 months in which every person who had watched that episode lived in some small way inside the experience of not knowing who was going to die. That is a remarkably strange thing for a television show to accomplish. The Walking Dead did not just make its audience watch a character die, it made them anticipate it, dread it, argue about it, lose sleep over it, in a way that replicated, in miniature and from a position of safety, the specific psychological state that the survivors in that clearing were experiencing while they knelt on the ground and waited for the bat to land. The execution was imperfect. The intent was, by any serious analysis, coherent. Negan had not just terrified the characters inside the story. He had stepped out of the story and terrified the audience as well. He had made them feel, in their living rooms, something close to what it felt like to be powerless. That is an extraordinary thing for a fictional character to do. That is the first piece of evidence for why he is the greatest villain the show ever produced. The Season 7 premiere of The Walking Dead aired on October 23rd, 2016. It was called The Day Will Come When You Won't Be. It drew 17 million same-day viewers, which made it the most watched episode of the season and one of the most watched episodes in the series' history. People came back because they needed to know. They had been waiting 6 months for an answer that the show had deliberately withheld, and their return to the premiere was, in its way, a demonstration of exactly how much leverage Negan had generated over the audience without ever having killed anyone on screen. The premiere answered the question in 2 parts, and the way it answered it, the sequencing, the specific choice of victims, the ordering of revelations, was not accidental. It was the most carefully constructed 45 minutes of television. The Walking Dead had produced since the early seasons, and it remains, for all of the criticism that surrounded it, one of the most devastating hours of the show's entire run. Abraham Ford was the first victim. He was selected during the rhyme. He is sitting on his knees in that clearing, and Negan walks toward him with Lucille raised, and Abraham does something that is, entirely consistent with everything the character has been across 3.5 seasons. He squares his shoulders and he looks Negan directly in the eye, and he does not look away. He does not beg. He does not cry. He gives Sasha, the woman he loves, who is kneeling 15 feet away from him, a final peace sign. It is the most Abraham thing that Abraham could possibly do in that moment. It is a farewell and a declaration simultaneously. I am not afraid of you. And I want her to know that I am not afraid of you. And I want her to know that I love her. And I need to fit both of those things into a single gesture, because I am not going to have time for anything else. Negan brings the bat down on Abraham's head. The show does not cut away. Lucille strikes, and Abraham's head splits, and blood drips down his face, and Abraham Ford gets back up. He looks at Negan with his head broken and his blood running down his nose and into his beard, and he says, clearly and without wavering, "Suck my nuts." It is 3 words. They constitute one of the most precise pieces of character writing the show ever produced, because they tell you everything about who Abraham was and what he believed and how he wanted to leave. He had no power in that moment. He had no leverage, no options, no possibility of survival. What he had was himself, intact right up until the end. He spent the last breath available to him on defiance, and it cost him nothing, because there was nothing left to cost him. Negan continues. He beats Abraham to death in the specific, relentless, mechanical way that the show renders this kind of violence, not glorified, not made exciting, not edited for pacing. It is long, and it is ugly, and it is deliberate. When it is finished, Negan pauses. He observes the bat. He observes the group. He notes Rosita's specific anguish with what appears to be genuine curiosity rather than satisfaction, and he tells her to look at what his bat has done. He wants her to see it. He wants all of them to see it. This is not personal. This is a lesson, and the lesson has a visual component. It is at this moment that Daryl Dixon, who has been kneeling in that line and watching someone he cared about be murdered in front of him, breaks. He lunges at Negan. He does not have a weapon. He does not have a plan. He has a grief that is larger than his capacity for restraint, and he acts from that grief, and the saviors pull him back before anything happens to Negan. Negan does not kill Daryl. He observes what has just happened with something that looks, briefly, like respect. He acknowledges it, and then he explains, with the calm of someone reciting a policy that has been in place for a long time, that there are consequences for this kind of resistance. The first one was free, meaning Abraham's death was the cost of Rick's group having killed saviors. That debt has been paid. Now Daryl has created a new debt. And unlike the first one, which Negan decided in advance, this one is arbitrary. It falls on whoever happens to be most vulnerable, most easily hurt, most effective as a demonstration of what non-compliance produces. He looks at Glenn Rhee. Glenn's death in that clearing is, by the consensus of most serious analysis of the series, the single most devastating moment in The Walking Dead's 12-season run. Not because it is the most graphically violent, though it is extraordinary in that regard. Not because Glenn was the most beloved character, though for many viewers he was precisely that. The man who had saved Rick in Atlanta in the very first episode, who had met and fallen in love with Maggie Green, who had survived more impossible situations than almost any other character on the show, who was about to become a father. Glenn's death is the most devastating moment in the show's run because of what he does after the first blow lands. Negan strikes Glenn's head with Lucille. The blow is staggering. It dents his skull and dislocates his left eye. Glenn falls, and then Glenn gets back up. His head is catastrophically damaged. One eye is no longer functional and is displaced from its socket. He is dying, and he knows he is dying, and he uses the last coherent moment available to him to turn and look at Maggie. Maggie, who is his wife. Maggie, who is pregnant with his child. Maggie, who is kneeling 15 feet away and watching this happen to her husband. Glenn looks at Maggie and says, "Maggie, I'll find you, not goodbye. Not I love you," which would have been true and sufficient and less than what the moment required. He tells her he will find her. He is a man who has survived 6 seasons of impossible circumstances on the belief that survival was always possible if you were willing to do what it took, and he applies that belief to the last statement available to him. He will find her. Wherever it is that people go when they leave, he will find her there. Negan finishes the job. The show does not cut away from this either. It commits to the full weight of what it is depicting, in the same way it committed to Abraham's death, because cutting away would be a mercy that the moment does not allow for. Maggie watches, the group watches, the audience watches. When it is done, Negan pauses for a moment that reads, "Under any careful attention to Jeffrey Dean Morgan's performance, as genuine, not satisfaction, not triumph, but something closer to the particular discomfort of having done something that was necessary within his own moral system and that he nevertheless recognizes as terrible." He looks at what he has done. He apologizes, briefly, sincerely, in the way you might apologize to someone after you have hit them accidentally with a door. And then he reminds everyone that there are no exceptions. This is how it works. Now everyone knows. Here is the thing about that apology that makes Negan irreducible as a character, and it is worth dwelling on because it is the thing that separates him from every other villain the show produced. Negan's brief, sincere apology to the group after killing Glenn is not a performance. It is not calculated to manipulate. It is the genuine response of a man who has a moral system, a coherent, internally consistent moral system, and who recognizes that what he has just done required him to violate part of it. He did not intend to kill Glenn. He intended to kill one person as a demonstration. Glenn's death was produced by Daryl's resistance, which was produced by Abraham's death, which was produced by Rick's group having killed dozens of saviors in their sleep. Every link in that chain has a logic. Negan can trace the logic. He does not enjoy every consequence of the logic. He accepts it, because the logic is the system, and the system is the only thing standing between the world he is running and the chaos that existed before it. That is not the reasoning of a monster. It is the reasoning of a person who has decided that order, at any cost, is more important than individual justice. There are governments in history, and history is not lacking in examples, that have operated on precisely that reasoning and produced precisely the kinds of atrocities that emerge from it, and believed themselves, sincerely, to be doing what was necessary. Negan is not a cartoon. He is a recognizable type of human being, organized around a recognizable type of conviction, operating in a context that gives that conviction maximum room to express itself. That is the thing about his villainy that the show, in its best moments, never let you forget. The rest of the Season 7 premiere follows Negan's methodical psychological dismantling of Rick Grimes, which is the other piece of what the episode accomplishes, and which is, in certain ways, more disturbing than the deaths that precede it. Negan has killed Abraham and Glenn. That is done. Now he needs to do something that is, in the specific logic of his system, more important. He needs to make Rick Grimes understand that he is no longer in charge, at a level so fundamental that Rick cannot simply decide the next morning to go back to being in charge. He needs the understanding to be physiological. He needs it in Rick's nervous system, not just his rational mind. He drags Rick into the RV. He drives off alone with him through the darkness and the fog. He sits Rick in the back with his own axe on the table and dares him to use it. Rick charges. Negan has a rifle he was concealing. Rick drops the axe. Negan starts the RV again. He drives through fog and smoke, and he says things to Rick that are designed to disorient rather than threaten. Observations about the blood spatter patterns that walkers leave on windscreens. Observations that do not make immediate sense and are not intended to. He throws Rick's axe up onto the roof of the RV and orders Rick to retrieve it. And when Rick does not move immediately, Negan pushes him out the door. Rick is in a fog, surrounded by walkers, unarmed, with his axe on the roof of an RV that he cannot get back into until he has done what Negan told him to do. The physical geometry of the situation is the point. Negan has engineered an environment in which Rick has exactly one available action, and that action is the one Negan wants. Rick fights through the walkers, he climbs onto the roof, he gets the axe. He is shaking, covered in blood that is not entirely his own, standing on top of an RV in the middle of a clearing surrounded by the dead, while the man who murdered 2 members of his family watches him from inside. He gets the axe and he brings it back, and Negan takes it from him. What happens next is the completion of the process. Negan parks the RV back in the clearing, where the rest of the group is kneeling. He cleans the axe. He talks to Rick about the nature of leadership and the importance of having a right-hand man. He walks Rick out of the RV and back to his people, and then he tells Rick that the purpose of the drive, the fog, the walkers, the axe on the roof, was to change the way Rick looks at him. He says, "But you're still looking at me the same damn way." He believes Rick does not fear him sufficiently yet. So he calls Carl over. He wraps his belt around Carl's arm as a makeshift tourniquet. He draws a line on Carl's forearm with a marker. He gives Rick the axe. He tells Rick to cut off Carl's arm, and he tells him that if he does not, every person in that clearing will die, including every person in Alexandria. He starts counting down from 3. Rick begs. He has never begged in 6 seasons of The Walking Dead. He begs for the chance to take Carl's place. He cries. On 2, Carl whispers to his father, "Dad, just do it." And Rick raises the axe. Negan stops him. Not because he's changed his mind about the demonstration, because the demonstration is complete. Rick, with tears on his face and an axe in his hand, about to mutilate his own child, is the demonstration. That is what Negan needed to see, and he has seen it, and Rick can lower the axe now. Rick agrees with a broken voice that he provides for Negan, that everything belongs to Negan, that he is Negan's now. Negan is satisfied. He leaves the group with a truck and a 1-week deadline for their first offering, and he goes. Think about what that scene required the show to do. It required the show to take Rick Grimes, a character built over 6 seasons as the embodiment of the idea that a person of sufficient will and moral clarity could survive anything, and break him completely in front of his own son and his own people in a way that could not be quietly unbroken off-screen between seasons. It had to be total. The audience had to see it happen, had to watch Rick Grimes, survivor of every crisis the apocalypse had previously generated, reduced to a man who was about to cut off his child's arm because someone told him to, and the audience had to understand, in that moment, that Negan was not wrong about what he needed. He was right. Rick needed to feel, in his bones and in his hands, what powerlessness actually felt like. He had been in danger before. He had never been in someone else's power before. Those are not the same thing. That is what Negan accomplished in the Season 7 premiere. Not 2 deaths, though the deaths were real and permanent and devastating. He accomplished the psychological restructuring of the most capable survivor the show had produced in the span of 45 minutes, using nothing but a baseball bat, an RV, and the precision of his own understanding of how human beings work. That is the second piece of evidence for why he is the greatest villain the show ever produced. The Sanctuary, as a physical location and as a governing structure, is one of the most sophisticated pieces of world building The Walking Dead ever attempted, and it is almost entirely underappreciated in retrospect, because the conversations about Season 7 are so dominated by what happened in the premiere that the rest of the season rarely receives the attention it deserves. What the show built at the Sanctuary across Season 7 is a fully realised alternative civilization, one with a functioning economy, a clear hierarchy, a set of rules that are internally consistent and consistently enforced, and a social contract that, however warped by the specific power structure at its centre, provides the people inside it with genuine stability. It is not a concentration camp. It is not a slave colony. It is something more complicated and more disturbing than either of those things, because the people inside it, by and large, have chosen to be there on the terms that Negan offers. The terms are these: at the lowest level, workers earn points. Points are exchanged for goods, food, medicine, comfort items, whatever the sanctuary has to trade. The point system creates an incentive structure that produces compliance through self-interest, rather than through constant direct coercion. You do not need to threaten a person with violence every morning if they have a reason, in their own interest, to perform the work you need them to perform. The threat of violence exists as a backstop, a last resort for cases where the incentive structure fails, but it is not, on an ordinary day, the primary mechanism of control. Ordinary people in the sanctuary go about their lives. They eat, they work, they accumulate points, they trade for things that make their lives slightly better. The apocalypse has not ended for them, but it has been made manageable, which is not nothing. At the next level are the saviors, the armed enforcers, the people who go out into the world to collect tribute from the communities under Negan's authority and to deal with whatever resistance those communities might produce. The saviors occupy a privileged position within the sanctuary's hierarchy. They have more access, more resources, more of everything. They are also, by definition, the most directly implicated in the violence that sustains the system. They are the face of the protection racket when it comes to collect, and at the top level are Negan's lieutenants, people like Dwight, like Simon, like Arat, who manage specific operational domains and report directly to Negan. This tier is also the tier that requires the most from the people in it, because proximity to Negan means proximity to the consequences of his displeasure, which are immediate and physical and not subject to appeal. Dwight's story is the clearest illustration of how the sanctuary's top tier functions as a trap that the people inside it built for themselves. Dwight, his wife, Sherry, and Sherry's sister Tina were originally workers in the sanctuary. When Tina fell behind on her points because of the cost of medication she needed, Negan proposed to marry her as a way of resolving the debt. The three of them ran instead. They stole medicine and fled. When Tina died during the escape, Dwight and Sherry returned to the sanctuary and asked for forgiveness. Negan's terms for forgiveness were as follows. Sherry would marry Negan, and Dwight's face would be pressed against a heated iron for long enough to produce a permanent scar. Dwight accepted these terms. He did not accept them because he was broken. He accepted them because the alternative was both of them dying, and he chose survival on brutal terms over dignity on a corpse. What the show does with Dwight across Season 7 is trace the psychological consequence of that choice across the months and years that follow it. Dwight is a loyal saviour. He enforces Negan's rules. He brings Daryl in line. He does the things that are required of him in his role, consistently, effectively, and with the specific efficiency of a person who has decided that the way to survive inside a terrible situation is to be indispensable to the terrible situation. But he is also a man in a stairwell with his wife, smoking cigarettes and remembering a version of their life that existed before they made the choice to come back, asking each other whether the deal they struck was supposed to have cost quite this much. Negan's relationship with Dwight is one of the most textured things the show produced in its later seasons. He trusts Dwight in the specific way that the powerful trust those who have demonstrated they will absorb extraordinary personal cost to remain useful. He also understands, with the precision of someone who has built a system specifically designed to produce this dynamic, that Dwight's loyalty is not freely given. It is purchased, paid for in scar tissue and in the daily reality of watching your wife be someone else's. Negan is not sentimental about this. He is the one who set the price. The iron itself, the heated clothes iron that Negan uses to brand people who break his rules, is one of the show's most efficient visual shorthand for what the Sanctuary's justice system actually is. In the Season 7 episode Sing Me a Song, Negan uses it on a saviour named Mark, who has violated the rules regarding contact with one of Negan's wives. The scene is staged as a public event, which is the point. It is not punishment administered in private between the offender and the authority. It is punishment administered in a factory, in front of the entire community, with everyone required to watch. Negan explains, before the iron is applied, why the rules exist and why they have to be enforced. He is not angry. He is almost professorial. He has done this before. He will do it again. The iron hits Mark's face and Mark screams and passes out, and Negan calmly tells his doctor to tend to Mark and inform everyone that he is forgiven. He is forgiven. The iron was not revenge, it was a transaction, and the transaction is complete. That distinction between revenge and transaction, between violence as expression and violence as governance, is everything. It is what separates Negan's villainy from the governor's, which was personal and volatile and ultimately self-defeating because it was driven by individual psychology rather than structural logic. Negan's violence is institutional. It is the violence of a system that has decided to use extreme consequences to enforce compliance with rules, which is, again, not a thing that only fictional dystopias have done. The iron is not unique to the Sanctuary. The iron has appeared, in one form or another, in every society that has decided that the most efficient way to maintain order is to make the consequences of disorder visible, permanent, and public. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The episode Sing Me a Song is also the episode that delivers the most complex and contradictory version of Negan that Season 7 produces, because it is the episode in which Carl Grimes climbs out of a cargo truck at the Sanctuary, gun in hand, and opens fire on the saviours unloading the truck, demanding to see Negan. Carl is 16 years old. He has lost an eye to a stray bullet in Season 6. He is watched from a position of enforced powerlessness as Negan killed Abraham and Glenn and then broke his father in front of him. He has decided, with the specific clarity of a traumatized teenager who has internalized a world in which violence is the primary available response to injustice, that he is going to kill Negan. He has the determination and the capability. He does not have a plan that accounts for being surrounded by hundreds of armed saviours. Negan walks up to him. Carl has a machine gun pointed at him. Negan is smiling. He says to Carl with the tone of someone who has just been given an unexpected gift, "You look adorable." He uses a nearby saviour as a human shield. He tells Carl calmly to lower the gun. Carl refuses. Negan threatens to cut off Daryl's arm. Carl lowers the gun. What follows across the rest of the episode is, by any serious measure, the most revealing extended sequence of Negan's character that the show produced in its first 7 seasons. He does not put Carl in a cell. He does not threaten him further. He takes him on a tour. He shows him the Sanctuary, the floor where workers earn their points, the wives' quarters, his own apartment. He explains the system, not as propaganda, but with the specific candour of someone who is genuinely proud of what he has built and sees no reason to lie about it. He is showing Carl the truth. The truth is that it works. Whatever else is wrong with it, it works. He introduces Carl to his harem, which the show handles with the delicacy of something it knows is uncomfortable and chooses not to flinch from. Negan's system of wives, women who have agreed to marry him in exchange for elevated status and resource security, is one of the most consistent points of moral critique against his character, and the show does not soften it. It depicts it as a system of coercion dressed as choice, which is what it is. The women are not prisoners in a technical sense. The nature of their freedom within the Sanctuary's hierarchy is such that the concept of a freely made choice barely applies. And then Negan takes Carl to his apartment and sits across from him and asks him to remove his eye patch. Carl refuses. Negan tells him that he killed 2 saviors and has to repay him. Carl removes the patch. Negan looks at the scar where Carl's eye used to be, and he begins to mock it with the specific cruelty of a man probing for a reaction, seeing what's underneath, testing the character of whoever he is talking to. The mockery escalates. Carl begins to cry. The tears are involuntary, the product of humiliation compounding grief, and they happen in front of the man who killed his friend and broke his father, which makes them worse. And then Negan stops. He goes quiet. He says, "I did not mean to make you cry." He looks at Carl with what the performance makes unmistakably clear is something real, not performed regret, not calculated softening, but the genuine response of a man who has just caused pain he did not intend and is not comfortable with having caused it. He apologizes. He tells Carl his eye is rad as hell. He tells him to leave the bandage off so no one will mess with him. He says, "I need to remember you're a kid." Think about what that sentence is. Negan is sitting across from a 16-year-old boy who climbed into a cargo truck to assassinate him, who has just told him that he watched Negan kill his friends and needed to remember it so that the memory would motivate him to come back and finish the job. And Negan's response is an apology for making him cry. Not because he's afraid of Carl, not because the apology serves any strategic purpose, because he forgot, in the interrogative momentum of the scene, that the person across from him is a child. And when he remembered it, it mattered. That mattered to him. The mattering is real. This is the contradiction at the centre of Negan's character that makes him the most interesting villain the show ever produced. He is capable of genuine care. He is capable of something that, in a different context, might be described as tenderness. The same person who murdered Glenn Rhee in front of Maggie Green, who branded Dwight's face with a hot iron, who built an entire civilization on the premise that suffering is the most reliable currency available in a lawless world. That same person looked at a crying teenager and felt something he did not want to feel and chose to acknowledge it. Both of those things are true simultaneously. He is not a monster who occasionally pretends to be human. He is a human being who has constructed a system that requires him to perform monstrous acts, and who has not entirely succeeded in killing the part of himself that knows the difference. The episode makes this explicit in its final scenes. When Negan discovers Judith in the nursery at Rick's house, he had come to Alexandria with a large contingent of saviors to make their first collection. He had taken furniture, he had taken mattresses, he had made a point of walking through people's homes and deciding what he wanted, and then he found the nursery, and he picked up Judith. He held her the way you hold a baby you are genuinely delighted by. The way someone holds a baby when babies are something they find uncomplicated and joyful. He sat on Rick's front porch with Judith in his lap, this tiny child who represents everything Rick has been fighting to protect, and he rocked her and made faces at her nose and said, conversationally to Carl sitting beside him, that he was thinking about killing Rick and moving in. He is not going to kill Rick. He knows he is not going to kill Rick. Rick, alive and producing, is more valuable to Negan than Rick dead and replaced by whoever comes next. But he sits there with Judith, in Rick's house, in the community he has just collected tribute from, and he says it anyway. Not as a threat, as a thought experiment. What would it be like to have this? What would it be like to live in a house, with a child, in a world that had simplified itself down to its necessary elements? He smiles at Judith. He kisses her nose. The show holds the image. That image, Negan with Judith, in the house, on the porch in the afternoon, is the most disturbing thing the show produced in Season 7. More disturbing than the baseball bat, because the baseball bat you can hate. You know what to do with the baseball bat. You do not know what to do with this. You do not know what to do with a man who can beat someone to death in a clearing, and then, 3 episodes later, hold their leader's infant daughter and seem completely, genuinely, peacefully happy about it. You do not know where to put that, and not knowing where to put it is precisely the effect the show was after. Negan is not one thing. He was never one thing. The man who named his bat after his dead wife, who could not bring himself to put her down when she turned, who burned their house down instead and walked out into the apocalypse with a grief too large to contain. That man did not disappear when he found the saviors. He adapted. He organized his grief into a system. He made the grief productive in the specific sense that the post-apocalyptic world rewarded productivity and punished sentiment. He became, over the years between Lucille's death and the road in Virginia, the most powerful person in the eastern seaboard. And he did it without ever losing the capacity for the specific kind of feeling that he experienced sitting on Rick's porch with Judith in his lap. That capacity is the most frightening thing about him. It is also, eventually, the thing that saves him. But that is still several seasons away. That is the version of Negan that Season 7 commits to across its full run. Not a single note, not a single register. A person capable of the worst things the show depicted, and also capable of something real and recognizable underneath them. Something the show insisted on showing every time it had the chance, because the insistence was the point. The insistence was what made him great. The first collection visit, the day Negan arrives at Alexandria with a convoy of over 30 saviors and announces that he will be the one to decide what half of their supplies means, is the episode that demonstrates what the tribute system looks like in practice after the theory of it has been established in the clearing. It aired as the 4th episode of Season 7, an episode called Service. Negan arrives unannounced. He bangs on the gate. Spencer Monroe, who happens to be at the gate when Negan arrives, and who does not immediately recognize the man whose name has reorganized the entire community's understanding of its own future, opens it cautiously. Negan strides in. He thrusts Lucille into Rick's hands as he passes him. He says simply, "Hold this." That gesture is the complete expression of the relationship in miniature. Negan hands Rick his own weapon, the weapon that killed Rick's friends, and walks into the community Rick built. And Rick holds it because Rick holding it is the demonstration. Not just for Negan, for everyone watching, for the Alexandrians who have been told by Rick that the saviors are in charge now, that there is no other option, that the only path forward is compliance. Rick is holding Lucille. That is the picture of compliance. That is what it looks like from the outside. Negan moves through Alexandria with the proprietary ease of someone walking through a space they own. He looks at houses. He notes what is in them. He tells Arat and his other lieutenants what he wants taken. He asks about Maggie Green, whose death Rick has fabricated with Gabriel's assistance. A ruse that Negan appears to accept, though the show never quite resolves whether he believed it or simply chose not to press. He takes Rick to the graveyard where Glenn and Abraham are buried, where a third grave now sits for the fictional Maggie, and he says he had plans to ask her to be one of his wives. He says this while Rick is standing next to Glenn's grave. Rick tightens his grip on Lucille. He does not use it. The moment passes. When saviors discover that 2 guns from Alexandria's armory are unaccounted for, Negan threatens to kill Olivia, the woman who manages the community's inventory, unless Rick produces them. He gives Rick a time limit. Rick calls a community meeting. He asks for the guns. He explains that there is no alternative to compliance, that the numbers are too large, that the only path forward is to give Negan what Negan wants. Spencer Monroe, who has been building a private grievance about Rick's leadership since before the saviors were a known factor, tells Rick that this is his fault, that they should have made a deal when they had the chance. Rick threatens to break Spencer's jaw if he speaks like that again. It is an interesting moment because it reveals something about what Rick's authority looks like inside Alexandria once the saviors are collecting tribute from it. He cannot protect the community from Negan. He can barely protect the community's basic dignity. What he can do still is maintain the internal hierarchy, make it clear that whatever Negan has taken from Alexandria, the community still answers to Rick and not to Spencer or to anyone else who thinks the current situation represents an opportunity for a power grab. It is the authority of a man who has been stripped of his most meaningful power and is protecting what remains. It is not a glorious thing to watch. It is a very human one. The mattresses are taken. The guns are taken. Michonne's rifle is taken. Daryl is in the van, pale and injured, and Rick is not allowed to speak to him. At the end of the visit, Negan refuses to leave without a thank you from Rick, and Rick gives it. He says thank you, in a voice stripped of everything except the compliance the moment requires. And Negan, before departing, tells Rick that he believes Rick is going to need the axe he has just given back to him. That he has a feeling. He leaves with the mattresses and the guns and the supplies and Daryl, and Rick closes the gate, and Michonne finds the mattresses burned in a field on the side of the road, because Negan did not want them, and he never wanted them. He wanted the taking of them, which is not the same thing and is precisely the point. The taking is the point. The demonstration of what can be taken is the governance mechanism. The mattresses are a prop. What Negan is doing in Alexandria across Season 7 is not purely extraction, it is education. He is teaching Rick's group what it feels like to live inside his system from the community's side, rather than the sanctuaries. The hilltop has been living inside it long enough that Gregory has stopped imagining alternatives. Alexandria is new to it, and the newness produces the specific kind of resistance that Negan has encountered before. Not open warfare, which he can deal with efficiently, but a low-grade structural non-compliance, a quiet refusal to fully inhabit the role he needs them to inhabit. Michonne hides a rifle, Rosita has Eugene make her a bullet, Carl hides in a cargo truck. These are not revolution. They are the gestures of people who are not ready to accept, at a cellular level, that the terms of their existence have permanently changed. Negan's project with Alexandria, across the first half of Season 7, is to make the change feel permanent. Not just to Rick understood in the clearing, but to everyone Rick is responsible for. He is not entirely wrong that this is necessary. A tribute system that relies entirely on direct coercion for every collection is operationally unsustainable. You cannot send enforcers to every community every day. The system requires eventually that the communities internalize the terms well enough to comply without constant supervision. The goal is not fear as an end state. The goal is the behavior that fear produces, which is to say, the goal is tribute, consistently, on schedule, without incident. Fear is the mechanism. Compliance is the product. Negan is sophisticated enough to understand the difference. The war that eventually follows, all-out war across most of Season 8, is Negan's system encountering the specific kind of resistance it was not built to handle. Not a single community refusing to comply, which the system has tools for dealing with. Multiple communities coordinated with sufficient combined manpower to contest the sanctuary's operational dominance. Rick has spent the second half of Season 7 assembling this coalition, visiting the kingdom and the hilltop, and eventually the oceanside, constructing the argument that the combined weight of all the communities that Negan controls, coordinated and armed, could bring the system down. It is not a certain argument. It requires enormous trust between communities that have every reason not to trust each other. It requires Rick to promise outcomes he cannot guarantee. It requires everyone to accept that the cost of the war will be paid in lives, and that the payment will begin immediately. The war begins in Season 8, Episode 1, an episode called Mercy. Rick's coalition attacks multiple savior outposts simultaneously. Negan escapes the initial engagement, a fact that Rick anticipated and planned for, because killing Negan in the first episode of the war would have been either impossible or anticlimactic, and both the character and the show understood this. What follows is a season of back and forth, of tactical gains and setbacks on both sides, of alliances tested and characters lost, and the specific, grinding attrition that any protracted military campaign produces in a world where medical resources are limited and every casualty is permanent. Negan's Season 8 strategy is interesting because it reflects the same basic priorities that have always defined his approach: minimize casualties, maximize compliance, find the most efficient path to the outcome he needs. He does not want to destroy Rick's coalition. He wants it to surrender. He makes this offer multiple times, in various forms, across the season. He is genuinely willing to accept a surrender that leaves the communities intact. He does not need them dead. He needs them compliant. Dead people do not produce tribute. The weapons coating strategy, ordering his people to contaminate their blades and arrows with walker flesh, is the most disturbing piece of tactical thinking Season 8 gives him, because it is the most clearly non-retributive. It is not about punishing Rick's people. It is about creating casualties that the coalition cannot afford to sustain, in the most resource-efficient manner available. You do not expend a bullet killing someone when you can wound them and let the infection do it for you. The logic is horrible, and it is impeccable. It is, in miniature, the same logic that built the Sanctuary. Maximum output, minimum direct expenditure, maximum leverage from the mechanisms already built into the environment. Negan is always working with what the world provides. He has always been working with what the world provides. The grief the world provided him, early on, is what he started with. Everything he built came from organising that first material into something that could sustain forward movement. The war ends with the throat slash and the mercy, which have already been described. What has not been described is the specific quality of Negan's imprisonment that makes it the right ending for that phase of his story, which is this: it is not comfortable, it is not a symbolic imprisonment, it is a cell with bars with a concrete floor, and Negan is in it for years. He sees the outside world through a small window. He talks to whoever comes to talk to him, which is not many people. He sits with his thoughts, which have nowhere to go. The Sanctuary kept Negan's internal life organised around action, around management, around the daily operational demands of running a large and complex system. The cell removes all of that. It leaves him with himself, which is, given everything, a genuinely difficult thing to be left with. That is the completion of the cycle. The man who organised his grief into a system has had the system taken away. What remains is the grief. It is still there. It was always still there. He bashes his head against the concrete because he wants to see the bat. Not the bat as a weapon. The bat as the last piece of his wife, the last physical object in the world with her name on it. He begs to be killed so that wherever she is, he can be there too. The cell is not a punishment that exists outside of Negan's own history. It is the logical conclusion of his history, which is this: he built an external structure large enough to contain his grief, and the structure collapsed, and the grief is still there, and now there is nowhere for it to go except inward. The years in the cell are the years in which Negan becomes, however quietly and however incompletely, someone other than what the Sanctuary made him. Not because imprisonment rehabilitates people, which it often does not, but because time alone with the truth of what you have done, with no system available to organise the truth into something more manageable, has a particular effect on people who have enough honesty left in them to feel it. Negan has that honesty. He always had it. It is the thing that made him apologise after killing Glenn. It is the thing that made him stop mocking Carl when Carl cried. It is the thing that makes him, in the end, the character the show could never simply write off, because the honesty in him was always visible enough that writing him off would have been a lie about what the show had spent years establishing. He was always more than what he did. The doing was real. The more was also real. Both things permanently, without resolution. That is the truth the show arrived at, eventually, about the man who stepped out of that RV on a Sunday evening in April of 2016 and smiled and said his own name and began. Season 8 of The Walking Dead is called All Out War. It is the season in which the communities Rick has spent the second half of Season 7 carefully unifying: Alexandria, the hilltop, the kingdom, the ocean side, launch a coordinated military campaign against the Saviors. It is not a uniformly good season. It suffers from the pacing problems that had begun to characterize the show's middle years, and its battle sequences occasionally prioritize spectacle over character in ways that cost the season emotional weight. But it contains, embedded within its structural weaknesses, some of the most important moments in Negan's arc, and one in particular that recontextualizes everything that came before it and everything that will come after. Carl Grimes is dying. The disclosure arrives in the mid-season finale, episode 8 of season 8, called How It's Gotta Be. Carl has been bitten. Not by a savior, not as a direct consequence of the war. By a walker during an act of compassion while he was trying to help a stranger find safe passage into Alexandria. He has hidden the bite from his father for as long as he could, and now he cannot hide it anymore. The bite is on his torso. He has hours, not days. Rick contacts Negan via walkie-talkie and tells him that Carl is dead. His last wish, Rick says, was that the communities could make peace. Negan's response to this information is, under any careful attention to the performance, genuine. He goes quiet. He says he is sorry. He means it. The character who murdered Glenn and Abraham, who has spent an entire season engaged in a brutal war against these communities, is genuinely, visibly saddened by the death of a 16-year-old boy he met twice under adversarial conditions. Because Carl was not, to Negan, simply an enemy. Carl was the most honest person Negan had encountered in years. Carl had looked at him without the protective coating of either fear or deference, had challenged him directly, had cried in front of him, and then told him to his face that he was going to kill him. That kind of honesty is rare. Negan understood its value even when it was directed at him. He offers, in the aftermath of the news about Carl, to negotiate. He gives Rick a genuine offer. Surrender, accept Negan's leadership of all the communities, and the war ends. The terms are the same terms that have been in place since the beginning. Negan is not asking for anything new. He is offering to stop the killing. Rick refuses. And Negan, who is saddened by Carl's death, and who would, if pressed, admit that the war he is prosecuting has a cost he did not fully anticipate, begins planning the attack that will end it. What he devises is the weapons coating strategy. Negan orders his saviors to coat their blades and arrowheads in walker blood and entrails, specifically the infectious material that produces the turning process. The logic is precise and horrible. You do not have to kill someone in battle if you can wound them. A wound from a contaminated blade will kill them on a delay, through infection and fever and the subsequent turning, without requiring the expenditure of more ammunition or manpower than the initial injury. It is, from a tactical standpoint, extraordinarily efficient. It is also the kind of strategic thinking that reveals something about how Negan's mind works. He is always looking for the system underneath the surface problem, always looking for the mechanism that produces the result he needs at the lowest possible cost. The final confrontation of all-out war takes place in an open space outside the hilltop. Negan leads a convoy of saviors to what he intends to be the decisive engagement of the war. Rick drives a car into his, which crashes the vehicle. The two of them wind up alone in an abandoned building, or something close to alone, and Negan, who has lost Lucille in the fall, finds himself unarmed, being pursued by Rick Grimes through a darkened structure, in a reversal of the power dynamic that has defined their entire relationship. He attempts to negotiate. He offers to reduce the Savior's share of tribute. He offers to forgive Rick's transgressions entirely. He presents an argument for peace that has the specific quality of sincerity, not because Negan has become suddenly benevolent, but because Negan understands, and has always understood, that the war is inefficient. It produces casualties on both sides. It consumes resources that both sides need. It solves nothing that could not be solved by compliance, and compliance produces more over time than conflict. The war was never what Negan wanted. The war was what he needed when compliance was refused. He has always wanted the same thing, a functional system. The question was only ever who would be in charge of it. Rick asks for a moment to consider. He asks Negan to look at a window nearby, a stained glass window in the morning light. The kind of thing you notice when you're not looking for something to use as a weapon. He says, "This is the future Carl wanted." He picks up a shard of glass. He slashes Negan's throat. Then he orders his people to save Negan's life. This moment, the throat slash followed by the order to save Negan, is the most controversial creative decision of Season 8. And it was controversial for good reason. The audience had spent 2 seasons being told that Negan was an existential threat. 2 people they loved were dead because of him. Rick had cried about it. Maggie had built herself into a new person around the grief of it. The communities had gone to war because of it. And then Rick, in the moment of total victory, slashed Negan's throat and then stopped his own people from letting him die. He invoked Carl's name as justification. He said Carl wanted a future. He said this was the future Carl wanted. The criticism of this decision was and remains legitimate on its own terms. The show had not adequately prepared the audience for Rick's capacity for mercy toward Negan specifically. The 2 men's relationship had been defined entirely by conflict and power struggle, with no scenes that might have planted the seed of Rick choosing, at the decisive moment, something other than Negan's death. The mercy felt to many viewers like a choice made by the writers rather than a choice made by the character, which is the specific criticism that matters most in narrative analysis. When an audience says a character decision does not feel earned, what they are saying is that the character's internal journey to that decision was not depicted in the story, only the decision itself. That is a legitimate thing to say about Rick's mercy in Season 8. And yet, the mercy is, on its own terms, coherent. Not because Rick has forgiven Negan, he has not and will not, and the show does not pretend he has, but because Carl, who was the most morally clear-eyed person in Rick's family, who had watched Negan commit his worst acts from closer range than almost anyone, had decided, in the last weeks of his life, that the path forward could not be built on execution. Carl had been writing letters. He had been thinking about the world that came after the war, about what kind of world it should be, about whether the version of Rick that existed post-Negan would be a version that could inhabit a livable future. He had concluded that it could not if it was built on another death. He had written this down. He had given it to his father. Rick spares Negan because Carl asked him to. That is the complete answer. Whatever else is true about the decision, whatever structural criticism attaches to its preparation in the narrative, the motivation is clear, and the motivation is human. A man, in the moment of completing an act of vengeance he has wanted for 2 seasons, chooses instead the last wish of his dead son. That is not a sophisticated piece of political philosophy. It is a father, and the show has always, underneath everything, been about that. Negan goes to prison. Not a metaphor, not house arrest, not a banishment with a wink. A literal cell in Alexandria, with bars with a concrete floor, with the outside world accessible only through a small window. He is there for years. The show jumps forward in time at the start of Season 9, and Negan is still in his cell. He is there when Rick Grimes leaves the show, carried off by a helicopter explosion that the remaining characters believe has killed him. He is there when the time jump at the end of Season 9's first half puts the story 6 years further into the future. He has been in that cell for years. The man who commanded hundreds of saviors, who ran a tribute system spanning multiple communities, who was the most powerful person in the post-apocalyptic Eastern Seaboard, is sitting in a concrete room looking at a small window. The show uses Negan's imprisonment in Season 9 to do something it had not previously had the time or space to do. It puts him alone with the consequences of his choices, without the system he built to manage them, without the authority that gave his choices the cover of governance. He talks to Michonne through the bars of his cell. He sits in his cell and beats his head against the wall after begging to see Lucille the bat buried beneath a tree somewhere outside Alexandria, with tears on his face. He tells Michonne that his wife was an angel who deserved better than she got. He begs Maggie to kill him so he can be with Lucille. That last request is not a performance of suffering for Maggie's benefit. It is not a manipulation tactic. It is the most honest thing Negan says in any of his prison conversations. He misses his wife. He has been missing his wife since the night he burned their house down. The sanctuary and the leather jackets and Lucille the bat and all of it has been a structure built around that missing, a way of organising the grief into something with forward momentum. And now the structure is gone and the grief is what is left. He is in a concrete room with nothing to do but sit inside the grief he has been running from for years. When Maggie comes to kill him in Season 9, Episode 5, an episode called What Comes After, he tells her, "Go ahead, do it, so I can be with my wife." Maggie looks at him. She leaves. She tells him he is already worse than dead. He does not disagree. The Whisperer arc of Season 9 and 10 eventually gives Negan something to do again, and it does it through one of the show's most elegant structural choices. Carol frees Negan from his cell with a key she has left for him on the condition that he infiltrate the Whisperers and kill their leader, Alpha. Negan does it. He performs the infiltration with patience and intelligence, playing a role across multiple episodes, gaining Alpha's trust over time, and then killing her in Season 10, Episode 12, the episode called Walk With Us. He decapitates her with a knife. He brings her head to Carol. He has done what he said he would do. What the show does not rush and deserves credit for not rushing is Negan's re-entry into the Alexandria community after Alpha's death. He is not welcomed. He is tolerated because he's done something useful, but the tolerance is thin and conditional, and everyone knows it. Maggie Green has returned to Alexandria, and Maggie Green has not forgiven him, and is not going to forgive him, and does not pretend to be close to forgiving him. She looks at him the way someone looks at the person responsible for the worst thing that ever happened to them, which is to say, she looks at him the way Maggie Green has every right to look at Negan. And Negan, in Season 10's later episodes, makes no argument against that look. He does not explain himself. He does not make the case for his own rehabilitation. He exists in the community in the specific, uncomfortable way that a person exists who has done something that cannot be undone and has decided to live with that rather than running from it. He is not at peace. He is not redeemed. He is simply there inside the consequences of what he built and what it cost, trying to figure out what a person does with the years that remain after the structure they built their life around has collapsed, which is, of course, where the backstory episode arrives. Not as an explanation, not as a justification, as a reckoning. Here's Negan is the 22nd and final episode of the 10th season of The Walking Dead. It aired on AMC on April 4th, 2021, having been available on the streaming platform AMC Plus 2 days earlier. It was directed by Laura Belsey and written by David Leslie Johnson McGoldrick, drawing from the standalone comic story that Robert Kirkman had originally published in the Image Comics magazine Image Plus, beginning in 2016. The same story that had been collected and released as a standalone volume called Here's Negan in 2017, the year after Jeffrey Dean Morgan made his on-screen debut in the role. Jeffrey Dean Morgan had been requesting this episode in various forms since approximately 2016. He had been told it might be a film. He had been told it might be a mini-series. For 5 years the conversation had been ongoing, and for 5 years the definitive backstory that would explain Negan to the audience at the level the character deserved had not materialised, until it did in an extended bonus episode of the final season's extended run, delivered on a Sunday night in April when the main show's audience had already contracted significantly from its peak, but the people who remained were, by definition, the people who had been paying the most careful attention. The episode received strong reviews from critics. On the review aggregator site IMDb, it was rated 9.2 out of 10 by viewers, placing it among the highest-rated episodes in the show's history. Alex MacLeod, writing for the AV Club, called it the best of the bonus episodes and noted that it effectively bookended the season's other strong character episode, providing a structural symmetry that the bonus run as a whole benefited from. Eric Kane, writing for Forbes, called it one of the best episodes of the entire series, and specifically one of the best since the early seasons. Matt Fowler of IGN awarded it 8 out of 10. Jeffrey Dean Morgan himself, in an interview with Entertainment Weekly, said, "It was probably the coolest thing I've ever gotten to do." The episode is framed by the present, by Negan's position in Season 10, by the tension with Maggie, by his isolation within the Alexandria community. He has no obvious place inside. Carol takes him away from the community, ostensibly to give him a cabin to live in, actually to remove him from the proximity to Maggie that she believes will end in one of their deaths. She acknowledges at the end of the episode that she took him to the cabin specifically so that if something happened to him, it would not be on her conscience. Not because she particularly cares whether Negan lives or dies, but because she does not want to have caused it. She is honest about this. It is a very Carol thing to say, and Negan receives it with the specific equanimity of someone who has already made peace with the fact that no one in this community is going to be dishonest with him about how they feel. What Carol's action gives the episode is a reason for Negan to be alone, which is what the story requires. He needs to be alone in the place where he buried Lucille, the bat which he has not seen in years, which is buried beneath a tree with hanging stained glass windows somewhere outside the community's perimeter. He finds the tree, he digs up the bat. He is immediately in the presence of something that has become, over the years since the clearing in Virginia, one of the most loaded symbols in the show's history. The physical object that killed Glenn and Abraham, that terrified every community the Saviors touched, that Negan carried as a part of his personal mythology for seasons. In his hands now, weathered and brittle from years in the ground, it looks smaller than it did. It looks like what it always was, which is a bat, an object, a piece of equipment he named after someone he loved. He holds it, and the episode's flashback structure begins. The backstory the episode delivers covers the period from approximately 6 weeks before Lucille's death to a few months after it. The specific window in which the man who would eventually step out of an RV on a dark road in Virginia was still someone else. In the flashbacks, Negan is younger, quieter, softer around the edges, in a way that the leather jacket and the practiced theatrics of his sanctuary persona have long since eroded. He is nervous in scenes where the post-sanctuary Negan is never nervous. He is uncertain in situations where the Savior's leader would be completely, composedly, in control. He is, in the most fundamental sense, a person who does not yet know what he is going to become, because he has not been asked to become it yet. Hilary Burton Morgan plays Lucille. The casting is, in a word that the show rarely earns, and this episode earns completely, perfect. The chemistry between Morgan and Burton Morgan, which has the specific quality of chemistry that decades of actual shared life produce, a fluency in each other's rhythms that no amount of professional craft can manufacture from scratch, makes every scene in which they appear together feel entirely real. She is sharp and warm and completely clear-eyed about who she is married to, in the way that only people who have known someone for a very long time can be clear-eyed about them. She loves him with the specific love of someone who has decided to love a person who is not entirely lovable, which is the most honest kind of love the show had depicted in years. There is a scene in which they share a meal in their house, whatever they could find, cooked on a stove that still works, eaten at a table in a world that is ending, and they are simply a married couple having dinner. She is wearing her purple wig. He does not mention the wig. They talk about something inconsequential. She laughs at something he says. He looks at her like she's the last fixed point in a world that has become entirely unstable, which she is, and which she knows she is, and which neither of them says directly, because some things do not need to be said. The episode also explains the origin of the leather jacket, which is depicted exactly as the backstory established: a domestic argument, a hidden receipt, a hidden jacket in the floorboards. And the bat, which comes from Laura and her father at the medical supply camp, strangers who gave Negan what he needed to keep his wife alive, and offered him the bat as protection against a local gang. Laura will eventually become one of his first saviours. The bat that her father gave him as a practical object, a weapon with no ammunition requirement, suitable for the world that is emerging, will become the most feared symbolic object in the post-apocalyptic eastern seaboard. None of that is knowable in the moment of the gift. It is simply a bat. It is simply protection. When Lucille dies, when Negan returns to their house after searching for medicine he was not able to find in time, and finds the house silent in the specific way that tells him, before he has found her, that she is gone. The episode handles the moment with a restraint that makes it more devastating rather than less. He does not find her immediately. He calls her name. The house answers with silence. When he does find her, he sits with her for a while, in the specific paralysis of grief that prevents the body from doing what the mind knows needs to be done. He cannot bring himself to stop her from turning. The show does not depict the moment he makes that choice. It depicts the fire rising from the house, visible from outside, and then Negan walking away from it through the trees, with the bat in his hand. What he is walking toward, he does not yet know. He is walking away from the only thing that was keeping him in one piece. In the present-day framing of the episode, a walker finds Negan at the tree where he has dug up the bat, and attacks. He kills it with Lucille. The impact, the wood that has been in the ground for years that has dried and weakened, splits the bat. The bat breaks. It is beyond repair. He sits with the broken bat, and then he says goodbye to it. He says goodbye to her, really, to Lucille the woman, through the last physical object that had been named after her. He apologizes to her. He apologizes for everything. For being a bad husband before the world ended. For not being there when she died. For naming a baseball bat after her and using it to do the things he used it to do. He apologizes for what he became. He says, "I'm sorry I left you." He burns the bat in a fireplace in the cabin. He watches it go. He is at peace with his past in a way that, the episode argues, he could not have been if he had not returned to the place where the bat was buried and sat with what the bat actually was. Not a symbol, not an icon, a piece of wood, named after a woman who deserved better than she got and loved him anyway. He walks back to Alexandria. Carol has told him that Maggie will likely kill him if he stays. She says she will feel no guilt if that happens, which is, as noted, a very Carol thing to say. Negan accepts this. He accepts it with the specific calm of a person who has burned the last external structure of their grief and has nothing left to protect. He walks back into Alexandria. Maggie is there. She looks at him. He looks at her. He does not flinch. He does not apologize, because an apology in this context would be insulting to both of them. It would be too small for what he did, and too easy for what she deserves. He simply walks past her. He is there. Whatever she does with that, she does. The episode ends there, on that image, which is not a resolution. It is the right ending, which is a different thing. Resolution would require Maggie to have forgiven him, or to have killed him, and neither of those things is available in the story at this point. What is available is the specific, uncomfortable truth that people who have done terrible things to each other sometimes have to share a world, and that sharing a world is not the same as peace, and is not the same as forgiveness, and is the most that can be asked of certain situations. Negan walks back into Alexandria, and he accepts whatever comes next. That is not heroism. That is not redemption. It is accountability, which is quieter and harder and less cinematic and more real. the show would eventually give Negan a spin-off, The Walking Dead, Dead City, which premiered in 2023 and sees Negan and Maggie travel together to a Walker-overrun Manhattan, continues the dynamic established in these later Walking Dead seasons. Two people who can never be comfortable with each other, bound together by shared necessity, navigating a relationship that has no language adequate to what it contains. Hilary Burton Morgan returns in Dead City as a hallucination. Negan, injured and searching for supplies, sees his dead wife in a purple wig, the version of her he remembers from her worst days, the version he associates most completely with his love for her, because loving her in her worst days was the most honest thing he ever did. The hallucination tells him he made up for his mistakes, that he clothed her and fed her and took care of her in the end, that what came after was not what she wanted for him. He cries. He goes back to save the child he has been protecting. He goes back because she would have wanted him to, and because what she would have wanted is still, after everything, the compass he uses when he does not know which direction to face. That is Negan's complete story, as the show told it across 12 seasons, and a spin-off and a backstory episode that arrived 5 years later than it should have, but landed when it did, with the weight of something that had been building for the entirety of the show's run. Not the story of a monster, the story of a man whose grief produced a monster, and who eventually had to come back and live inside the ruins of what the monster left behind. That is the reckoning the title of his backstory episode promises. It is not a reckoning with Rick Grimes or with Maggie Green, or with the communities he subjugated. It is a reckoning with Lucille. With the night he came home and the house was quiet, with everything that followed from that night and the choice he made walking out of it. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, and it is worth saying, because this is the argument the video has been building toward, and it is time to say it plainly, that the reason Negan's reckoning is possible, the reason the show can spend a full episode and a half season doing the work of dismantling and rebuilding him without it feeling unearned, is because the reckoning was always present underneath the character. It did not arrive in season 9 or season 10. It was in the season 7 premiere, in the moment after Glenn died and Negan looked at what he had done and apologised. It was in Sing Me a Song, when he forgot Carl was a child and remembered it and said so. It was in every scene in which the show allowed the person underneath the system to be briefly, undeniably visible. The reckoning was always there. The backstory episode only named it. That is the difference between a villain and a great villain. A villain does terrible things. A great villain does terrible things, and contains within those terrible things the exact architecture of their own undoing. Every act of Negan's cruelty carried the seeds of what would eventually make him something other than cruel. Not because cruelty is somehow self-correcting, but because the cruelty was never the whole truth of him. It was the part of him that the grief had given the most authority. And grief, even the most total kind, does not have permanent authority. It just has a very long run. There is a line from Robert Kirkman, the creator of The Walking Dead, that does not get cited as often as it should in conversations about Negan. Kirkman said, in an interview discussing the comic book version of the character, that Rick and Negan are two sides of the same coin, that the only real difference between them is that Negan's moral compass is a little more out of whack. That framing, offered casually in a conversation about source material, is actually a precise and disturbing piece of analysis, and it is the kind of analysis that the television show, at its very best, was attempting to dramatise across the seasons in which Negan was active. Think about what the two men have in common. Both of them lost the woman they loved to circumstances produced by the apocalypse. Rick's wife Laurie died in the prison during season 3. Negan's wife, Lucille, died 7 months into the outbreak. Both men responded to that loss by building something. Rick built a community, Negan built an empire, But the impulse in both cases was the same: impose structure on a world that had just demonstrated its capacity for total, irreversible loss. Both of them have done things that, evaluated outside the specific moral framework of the post-apocalyptic world they inhabit, would be indistinguishable from what Negan is condemned for. Rick executed a man in a bar in Season 2. Rick's group wiped out a savior outpost in their sleep in Season 6, killing dozens of people before they ever encountered Negan face to face. Rick bit a man's throat out during the Terminus confrontation. Rick, by any external accounting, is not a peaceful man. He is a man whose violence has been organised around the protection of his family rather than around the extraction of tribute from other communities, which is a meaningful moral distinction, but it is not as absolute a distinction as the show's framing of the Rick versus Negan conflict sometimes implied. Here is the thing about that parallel that the show understood in its better moments that made Negan work as a character. The difference between Rick Grimes and Negan Smith is not a difference of fundamental nature. It is a difference of who had someone to protect when the violence began, and who was left protecting someone who was already gone. Rick's violence has always had Judith and Carl at the centre of it, has always been legible as something in service of a love that the audience could see and recognise. Negan's violence had Lucille at the centre of it, a woman who died before the audience met her, a woman whose existence the show withheld for years because her existence was the entire answer to every question anyone had about Negan. Without Lucille, Negan is a monster. With Lucille, Negan is a man whose grief outgrew him. The show spent 6 years building Negan as a presence, and then spent the back half of its run asking what a presence like that looks like from the inside. What it found when it looked was not a void, it was a person who had organised his suffering into a system, who had convinced himself that the system was the point rather than the suffering being the point, who had been so effective at running the system for so long that the distinction had stopped mattering to him on most days. And then the system collapsed, and the suffering, which had been the original material all along, was still there, underneath everything, exactly as large as it had ever been. The prison did not produce the reckoning. The burning of the bat did not produce the reckoning. The reckoning had been present from the moment the house fire went dark, and Negan walked into the trees. He had simply been moving fast enough for long enough that he had not had to face it. The Walking Dead was a show about what people become when the structures that define them disappear. It asked that question of everyone it cared about, and it was most honest about the answer when the answer was uncomfortable. Carol became a person capable of killing children when children became threats to the people she loved, and the show did not flinch from that. Rick became a person capable of things that, evaluated from a distance, are not distinguishable from what he went to war against, and the show did not entirely flinch from that either, though it flinched more often with Rick than with anyone else. And Negan became a man who built a kingdom on fear because fear was the only language he had left. After love stopped working, and the show gave him, eventually, the time and space to dismantle what he had built and sit in the ruins and decide whether he was still the person he had been before he started building. The answer the show arrived at slowly across seasons 9 and 10 and the Here's Negan episode and the early Dead City material is the most honest answer it could have given. He is both. He is both the man who sat in a hospital room and refused to leave his dying wife, and the man who beat Glenn Rhee to death in front of the people who loved him. Both of those things are true. There is no version of his story in which one erases the other. The grief did not excuse the violence. The violence did not erase the grief. They coexist permanently, the way the worst and best things about any person tend to coexist, not cancelling each other out, but inhabiting the same space simultaneously, forcing everyone who looks at the person to hold both things at once without the comfort of resolution. That is what made Negan the greatest villain The Walking Dead ever produced, not the bat, not the leather jacket, not Jeffrey Dean Morgan's performance, though that performance was extraordinary and cannot be separated from the character it created. Not the eeny, meeny, miny, mo, not the sanctuary, not the throne room full of kneeling workers, or the iron, or the tribute trucks rolling into Alexandria with Daryl in tow. All of those things are the expression. The thing underneath the expression is a man who could not put down his dead wife, who burned their house around her and walked into the world with a baseball bat, who organized his grief into a system that lasted years and consumed hundreds of people, who sat with a baby on someone else's front porch and felt for a moment something quiet and ordinary and entirely human. The thing underneath the expression is a recognizable human being, and recognizable human beings who do terrible things are, by any measure that matters, more frightening than monsters. Monsters you can dismiss, people you cannot. The greatest villains in the history of dramatic storytelling share one quality above all others. They are comprehensible. You can trace step by step from the person they were to the person they became, and every step makes sense. And the making sense is the horror of it. Negan is comprehensible from start to finish. The gym teacher who lost his job and played video games and loved his wife in the inadequate way people love things they have not learned to value yet. The husband who stayed in the hospital and refused to leave. The man who burned his house down and could not say goodbye. The man who found a group of people surviving by violence and gave the violence a structure and a purpose and a set of rules. The man who sat in a cell and begged to see a baseball bat. The man who burned the baseball bat and walked back into a community that did not want him and sat with the consequence of his life without running from it. Every step makes sense. The making sense is the horror, and the making sense is also, in the end, the thing that makes him human. The thing that makes him, in all of his devastation and all of his grief and all of the irreversible damage he left behind him, a character that the show will not easily replace and will not easily forget. He stood in a clearing on a dark road in Virginia on April 3rd, 2016, and he smiled, and he said, "I am Negan." He was right. He had built a world in which that statement was the only identity that mattered, in which the individual, Dwight, Sherry, the hundreds of saviors who answered to the name as a collective, had dissolved into the system. He was Negan, and everyone around him was Negan, and the name had become something larger than the person it belonged to, something institutional, something that did not require the original person to sustain it. But the original person was still there, in the cell, at the tree, in the cabin with the fire, with the broken bat in his hands, apologizing to a woman who was not there to hear it, for everything he had done with the last piece of her that the world had left him. The original person walked back into Alexandria. He did not ask for anything. He did not explain himself. He simply walked back, which was all he had left to offer, and he offered it. And whatever came next was going to come next, regardless of whether he was ready for it. That is not the end of a villain's story. It is the end of a man's. And the distinction is everything. Negan Smith was a gym teacher from Reston, Virginia. He was a bad husband who became a good one too late, and a grieving man who became a warlord, and a warlord who eventually became, somewhere in the wreckage, something quieter and harder to name. He was the greatest villain The Walking Dead ever produced, not despite his humanity, but because of it. Not because he was frightening, but because he was comprehensible. Not because he could not be redeemed, but because the question of whether he deserved redemption was genuinely, honestly, impossibly complicated. The kind of complicated that does not resolve, that does not simplify, that asks the people watching to hold two things at once and sit with the discomfort of not being able to let either one go. He named a baseball bat after his wife. He carried it into the worst version of the world and used it to build something terrible and durable and, in its warped way, functional. He buried it under a tree. He dug it up and held it and burned it and said goodbye. We are the ones who live. And some of us, having lived the things that Negan lived, do not emerge from them as the people we were. We emerge as something that has to be looked at directly, and understood, and judged. And then, because judgment alone is not enough for a person still alive in a world that has not ended, lived alongside. That is what the show was doing, in its best moments, with the greatest villain it ever created. That is, here's Negan. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.